to the front seats. I know that we have been keeping the front seats in every session free, so please move up as you wish. We're trying to get it started. Para aquellos de ustedes que quieran seguirlo en español, desafortunadamente no vamos a tener traducción en esta sala porque no existe en esta sala, así que vamos a llevar la sesión en inglés. So again, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to have to present this panel and to moderate this session. We have really a very impressive roster of speakers and panelists. What I'm going to do is start by introducing very quickly the theme. I'm going to try to get away from that speaker there, and introduce the panel. And then we're going to break the panel into two parts. I'm going to ask the Honorable David Parker, who's Minister of New Zealand, and Peter Thomson, Ambassador Peter Thomson, who's the UN Special Envoy for Oceans, to give us some remarks to frame the discussion. Then we're going to go on with the panel. I also know that Minister Parker has to leave early, about half an hour before the end of the panel, and so we would let you go when you have to go. Okay, so just to introduce the theme, our concern here is how to make trade work for climate action. That's really the big concern that we have. We have been working at ICTSD now for 20 years on that theme. More recently, we have been doing work not only in the context of the WTO and regional trade agreements, investment agreements, and so on, but also making sure that trade policies at the domestic level support climate action, whether it is mitigation or adaptation, the whole realm of issues. A few years ago, in 2006 or 7, so that gives you an idea of what's a few years for me now in perspective, we did a very comprehensive review for about 4 or 5 years. We tried to map out all the linkages between trade policies, regulatory frameworks on trade at the international level, and climate change. Always with a certainty, and this is something that is very pleasant, if you like, in the work of ICTSD. When it comes to climate change, we have no doubt what our objective is there. We know that we have an unquestionable support for climate action. And so in the debate between trade policies, development policies, and climate action, we think that in the past 20 years, if I reflect about that journey, there's been some wavering, some doubting on where do you place the priorities. For us, it has been very clear from that very beginning. We need to make sure that trade policies do act in support of climate action, that they help particularly accelerate the transition to low-carbon economies, that they support rapid dissemination and diffusion of technologies that are necessary for climate action. And so we've done an incredible amount of work, and I apologize for being immodest, but it's piles of work, of analysis, to try to understand in detail how is it that this could happen. For instance, I'm just looking at Rick Samans, and Rick is Managing Director of the World Economic Forum, and in 2 of his capacities as Managing Director of the World Economic Forum, but also as Executive Director of the Global Green Growth Institute in Korea a few years back, we've worked together in one of the most challenging areas, which is how trade policy could support the transition to clean energy technologies. So at that speed and at the scale that it is necessary to really have an impact on climate change. We came up recently with a book that collects the ideas and analysis put together by many of our colleagues to propose what we call a sustainable energy trade agreement. So we've been very optimistic, knowing that many think in the trade policy realm particularly that it is infeasible, and I use that word because that's the word that most often comes about from a political perspective to think that we would have reforms in the trade policy realm that would really go as far and as quickly as those that we, some of the people that have been working on this, would like to propose. But even then, we continue with our mission. We know that this is a mission. We know that, unfortunately, we have on our side to advance reform the rapid change that, again, greenhouse gases is bringing in the climate. And so, unfortunately, my belief is that with biophysical changes, that urge really to go into reform is just going to become more and more acute. And so again, what we're trying to do is make sure that you have the analysis, that policymakers have the tools, that they have the options at their disposal to act again when we get into that situation. Now we're in a world of the Paris Agreement, and in that world of the Paris Agreement, it is even more important to ensure that trade policies take care of the possible negative spillovers of the policies that at the domestic level and in somehow in a unilateral manner are called for by the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement is constructed, as you know, in this hybrid where it is national determined contributions that are going to take us, hopefully, towards those goals that the global community has agreed to of the 2 degrees to stabilize the climate. But we also know that those national determined contributions, as they have been registered so far, are insufficient. Estimates by UNEP and others say that if they are fully implemented, it's only about 20 to 30% of the effort that is really needed by 2030 or 2050 to really stabilize the climate at the levels that we need. We have been looking in detail in cooperation with the German Development Institute, and Axel Berger is here from there, on to some of those, what it's contained in these national determined contributions from a trade policy perspective. And we know that there's a lot that countries can do to improve really using trade policy, their national determined contributions. But we also know that knowing trade policy, there is a big likeliness that we may get also into further tensions if there are not reforms in the trade system. So in that regard, Jim Bacchus, who is at the end of this panel here, as well as Gary Horlick, who's somewhere in the audience but is going to join us in a moment, have been working with us. Jim, as former chairman of the appellate body of the WTO, now a senior counselor with ICTSD, and in various forms, including again in work that we've been doing with the World Economic Forum and others, to look at the compatibility of the climate regime from a legal perspective with the current construct of the WTO and other regional and regional trade and integration agreements. And we know that there are issues that are very important, that it is very important that governments address, but they continue to be unaddressed in that respect. So we want to hear from them. With Gary Horlick, we've been working on issues related to specifically the reform of the rules on subsidies, generally in the trade system, but particularly so that they can serve these kind of policy purposes like the fight against climate change. Introducing the panel, as I am trying to do as I give you context, Beatriz Nofal has been the G20 Sherpa for Argentina in the German presidency, a brilliant economist, first female PhD from MIT who was appointed actually a professor at MIT very young, and so a big name in this region, and who has been looking particularly at the question of the competence or the, if you like, the competitive advantage of the G20 in global economic governance. And so again, Beatriz has been dealing with some of these issues from that global economic governance perspective. And so that's why we're very happy to have Beatriz with us. So I'm going to start again by asking Minister David Parker, and he has a wonderful portfolio to work on this area, also having been in a previous Labour government, Minister for Energy and Climate, as I understand, now Minister for Economic Development, Environment and Trade, and Associate Minister of Finance, to start with the framing. Then I'm going to turn again to Ambassador Peter Thomson. And Ambassador Peter Thomson, let me just introduce it at this stage, is very interesting. His role is very interesting at this stage. A very big advocate of reform of trade rules that deal with subsidies so that they can tackle the question of overcapacity, illegal and unreported and regulated fishing, as well as overfishing. So one of the big issues in the agenda at the WTO here in Buenos Aires, but also someone that has been looking at the question of climate change and vulnerability, formerly Ambassador of Fiji. He knows exactly about vulnerability and climate. And that's one of the issues that we wanted to highlight in this session. We had invited, but she couldn't come because she's chairing precisely the fisheries negotiating group here. We had invited Minister Tamina Johnson-Smith from Jamaica, who is also a champion of action on the climate, vulnerability, and trade policy nexus. And so I hope that we can also touch upon that theme. So, so with that, I think it's sort of an act to try to bring in the issues, bring in our guests. Let me then turn the floor to Minister David Berger to get the floor.
Thank you for that introduction. Thanks everyone for coming along. Is this going?
It should work. It should work.
Should work?
Yep.
Are we going now? Great. Thank you. I always feel a bit of a unqualified person on these panels compared with my esteemed guests, but I'll give it my best shot. New Zealand's we're a tiny player in the world, but we do have a strong environmental ethic. Last time we had a young Prime Minister was a guy called David Lange, who declared New Zealand to be nuclear free, and since then we haven't allowed nuclear-powered vessels to visit New Zealand, and we've been quite active internationally in trying to oppose the proliferation of nuclear weapons. We've recently elected an even younger Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, who's 38 years old, and one of the reasons why she became elected was that she resonated with the New Zealand public when she expressed her heartfelt belief that climate change is her generation's equivalent of the nuclear-free struggle that we haven't cured in the world, but that New Zealand sort of tried to play a role in. I think we, the reference to fish subsidies there is another example of where New Zealand's been pushing against fishing subsidies or subsidies for illegal fishing or fishing pressed fish stocks around the world. We've been at that for decades without much success until now, and the WTO, this meeting, is still pretty depressing on that front too. So I hesitate to be too optimistic in respect of these issues, but I will say what we're doing. I think every country has to start at home. You can't lecture the rest of the world unless you're trying to do your best at home. As was said previously, I was the Minister of Energy and Climate Change in New Zealand in the period 2005 to 2008. And I quickly claimed to the view that in order for New Zealand to make progress in respect of our CO2 emissions, we had to price them. We had to align the interests of the environment with the interests of the commercial actors who produce emissions and the consumers who purchase the products that have emissions embedded in them. And I still believe that unless the world properly prices emissions, we've got very little hope of combating climate change effectively. We know from the Paris Agreement that we've got to transition to a low emissions economy, and we know that each country's got to do its bit. we've committed in our current government to having a zero net carbon emissions economy by 2050. We're trying to take some of the politics out of that, because even in New Zealand, where we've got quite a strong environmental effort, the politics of emissions reduction are hard at times, and so we're introducing a climate commission modelled on the UK model to try and depoliticise some of the emission reduction paths. All of us in every economy in the world have our own cross to bear in respect of emissions reductions, and all of us have members of our economy and sectors of our economy and pressure groups saying it's too hard. Lots of people say, oh, we need a price on emissions, but please exempt me. And in New Zealand, we've got 50% of our emissions come from agriculture. For some time, we've had all of our CO2 emissions in an emissions pricing system, which has had its ups and downs, which I'll talk to a little. But we haven't been able to cross the Rubicon of getting political support to bring the 50% of our emissions that are in agriculture into our emissions pricing regime. We're about to do that in the next year or so. We won an election including that as a promise, and although there are not many emission reduction opportunities in ruminant agriculture, which is where most of our agricultural emissions come from, we still believe that it's economically rational to price their emissions so that at the margin they are penalised for emissions increases and rewarded for decreases, which will be the key to land use change, which will be the effective cause of most agricultural emission reductions in New Zealand as we transition to lower forms of lower land uses which have lower emissions. Whatever we do at home, we're only a fraction of 1% of the world's emissions, and so we can't do it alone. And even if we were to, and as we hope, even if we succeed in our ambition to get to net zero by 2050, the world will not overcome its climate change emissions problem. And so we need all of the international forces of capitalism pushing towards the right answer of emissions reduction, and trade policy is a necessary component to spreading the price of carbon into the world. I think that there's enough experiments now in emissions pricing around the world to know what does and doesn't work. We know that business needs a long-term price signal so that they can make their low emission investments with confidence, and to know that their high emissions investments are going to be less profitable. There's some good news on that in the last day. One of the big fund managers around the world, I see in the news in the last day, they're divesting, they're selling off their investments in tar sands in Canada. And that will be because they are concerned about the future profitability of those investments, and that must be, I think, because they foresee either a regulatory or price-based measure which decreases the relative value of those investments compared with alternative investments that they can make. The second part of the price, the second place where price is really important is actually the removal of subsidies. There is nothing cheaper that the world could do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions than remove the subsidies that go to fossil fuel around the world at the moment. If we can crack this nut, we'll make the poorer people in the world richer, and we will also have a greenhouse or CO2 emission reduction of probably about 10% by 2050. Those subsidies can be hard to knock off in different parts of the world, but really the forces that can bring that about, I think, are the larger trading economies. We can try and raise awareness, and some of you will be aware that we've had an initiative at this particular conference where we're trying to push against or push for fossil fuel subsidy reform, but in the end it's the big players and the likes of the G20 who will be able to push that into action. In terms of the G20, we know that they account for around 85% of GDP, 80% of trade, global trade, 2/3 of the world's population, and 3/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's pretty clear that unless the G20 does something, we're going to fail. If the G20 does something, we've got a greater chance of success. Some headway has been made. It's on the agenda for the G20 in a way that it didn't used to be. From the position of a small, isolated little country at the bottom of the Pacific, it seems to me that the G20 has got a power that we would only dream of, and we just hope that the G20 uses its power responsibly. Where would I suggest they start? Well, greater policy coherence around energy, including on renewables, energy efficiency. I think the G20 countries are already doing a fantastic job in pushing forward with fuel substitution and efficiency standard for new vehicles. And there's been significant progress made on that in the last decade, in my opinion. But they could do better in respect of getting the price signals right, including, as I've said, pricing carbon and phasing out inefficient subsidies. In respect of agriculture, we know that agriculture is responsible for a lot of the world's emissions. We're not going to crack that unless we crack the trade issues around more efficient production of food. This will be for the benefit of the third world, for developing countries as well as countries like New Zealand, if we phase out the inefficient subsidies and the trade blockages that stop more efficient forms of food production. Most importantly, G20s need to lead through their own actions. I think it's good that in that regard that Argentina is going to focus on sustainable food futures in its upcoming G20 presidency. Some of you will be aware that we've also played a bit of a role in that, trying to lead a global research initiative into lower emission forms of food production. We're making some progress in that, but not as much as we would have hoped for. So as a small developed country, you know, we'll continue to push on, but we can't do it alone. None of us can do it alone. I'd be interested to hear how hopeful members of the panel are that we can make progress through trade. I know that in respect of we've got a worry in New Zealand that we're seeing the deterioration of the multilateral rules-based system. We, and partly in response to the lack of advance in the multilateral system, are also pursuing bilateral arrangements. In our bilateral arrangements, we are very careful to protect our right to regulate at home, including in respect of climate change measures, and we have successfully protected that policy space in our bilateral free trade agreements, and we certainly think that every free trade agreement in the world should protect the right of countries to regulate at home in respect of all environmental matters, including climate change. I won't say anything more at this stage. I do find the fish subsidy issue incredibly depressing, because it implies for me that although we might talk a big game as to the future of trade and its effects on climate change, we've some ways to go before that's a reality.
Well, thank you very much, Minister Berger. That is a very comprehensive review of issues, and I think you put an emphasis at the beginning on something that is critical for the whole analysis. This is an economics problem. It's an issue of pricing carbon, pricing it where it should be, and then from there on. And so thank you for that. Let me turn, perhaps taking from where you left, to Peter Thomson. Peter.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everybody. What do we know? We know that we're all connected. This has been told to us by the ancient philosophers, and humanity has lived with that. Science is only just catching up to the fact that, yes, everything is connected. We live on this thin blue ecosystem, on this one planet that can sustain life in the universe. It's the only one we know about at this stage. And we know that all of our actions have consequences, so that burning fossil fuel repeatedly over the decades has consequences, and we are now seeing those. We're seeing those through climate change, and because of climate change, because of the warming atmosphere and the rise of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we're having ocean change as well. And that's measurable. We know it's happening. We know that because of the warming ocean and melting ice caps, that the sea level is rising at a faster rate than science had predicted. We know that the ocean is acidifying at a faster rate than we expected, which means it's going to make it harder for calcium-based life to exist in the ocean. That means vertebrates and shellfish and so on. We know that that dead zones are spreading, that deoxygenation is spreading at a faster rate than we thought. So all in all, the ocean is in deep trouble. And if you add to that unconscionable levels of marine pollution coming from human activity, mainly the plastics, and the insanity of overstocked and overfished fishing industries, then we really question humanity's right to continue with what it has been doing, which is existing on this planet. I mean, as a grandfather, I have a deep sense of shame as to what's happened in my generation, and I blame myself as much as anybody for this deep trouble into which we have put the ocean. Anyway, the good news is that since the Ocean Conference in June this year at the United Nations, you can see a palpable change in responsibility by humanity. Now there is hardly an institution which is not questioning their own role in ocean action. I was recently in London talking to the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth is introducing this Blue Charter, where, you know, if you're not a member of the Commonwealth, you might say, so what? But in fact, the Commonwealth, I think, controls about 3/4 of the EEZs of the world. That's Pacific Island countries like my own, and Australia, Canada, etc. You can see how that big number comes in. At the COP23 in Bonn, where Fiji was the president, huge responsibility for our country, but it's an existential issue for us as a Pacific Island country. So we were there, and we were launching an ocean pathway into the UNFCCC process, because to us it's nonsensical to talk about climate change without talking about ocean change in the same breath, because the ocean and the climate are so intimately linked. The China Council are doing great work through their CCI-CED on ocean issues. Everywhere I turn, I can see ocean action now taking place. So I am hopeful that there will be sufficient fidelity to SDG 14, Sustainable Development Goal 14, that we will in fact reverse this cycle of decline into which we've put the ocean. Why am I hopeful? Marine pollution, plastic pollution, that is just a matter of regulation. That's a matter of us stopping doing what we're doing. I'm old enough to remember a world where there was no plastic, and it was perfectly okay. We used matches to light out $6 billion worth of fish from us. Speaking as a Pacific Island country, it's theft. It's money that should be coming to us. It's an offense against the sustainable use of our fisheries, with these people coming in and stealing from us. $23 billion worth. So WTO must act first on that. They must ban subsidies for IUU fishing. Secondly is the human madness of overcapacity and overfishing. We saw what the Europeans and the Americans did to cod in the past. We don't want a repeat of that. 80% of our fish stocks around the world are under stress from overfishing. We don't want to see a repeat of that. You know, this is human madness on this planet if we continue with overcapacity and overfishing. So again, it's in WTO's powers to stop this madness so that we have fidelity to SDG 14. Because what is SDG 14? The conservation and sustainable use of the ocean's resources. Sustainable use. And overcapacity and overfishing are an offense to sustainability. We're stealing from our grandchildren, as I said earlier. Look, I'll just touch briefly on what does trade relate to. When I say climate action, I think ocean action. I just see them in the same breath. What does trade relate to that? Look, I used to be a trade development officer for Fiji, and how do you develop trade when every time you build up an industry, along comes a gigantic tropical cyclone and wipes it out? Right? And that's what we're experiencing now in the Pacific Islands. Every year, one of us gets hit where you just get 10 years of your development knocked out of you. What does it mean if you're developing kind of agricultural products on one of the atoll republics, Tuvalu or Marshall Islands or Kiribati, where rising sea levels mean that everything you've done is just spoiled by rising, the sea level rises within the atolls. Agriculture is in pits in these atolls. They're the first thing to go with the rising sea levels. It's not on the beach, it's coming up through the porous rock. That's why rising sea levels is going to kill off these and make these islands uninhabitable. So how can you develop trade in that situation? And we're not talking about sort of recent societies here. We're talking about humanity having lived for thousands of years in these settings with their own languages, their own cultures. It's just tragic that we are allowing this to continue. So look, I'll wind up here, and I'm very happy to answer more specifically on trade-related, but I think we've got probably better people to answer the trade work questions here. But for me, I'm here in Buenos Aires because I want to hold WTO accountable for SDG 14.6 and give the message that they've got to raise their ambitions on what's achieved here in Buenos Aires. If they're going to kick things down the road to 2019, fine, that'll still come within the 2020 target, but you need very strong language if you're kicking something down the road. We need commitments, because 2020 is the deadline to end overfishing, overcapacity, and IU fishing. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. So as I said before, again, we have introduced more subject matter to the discussion. Let me now break for a moment and ask, you need to go? Okay, very good. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Maybe, Gary, you can come and join us. That's good.
Tell people that there is place here that they can take.
Yeah. And people in the back, if you would like to come to their chairs here, in the front.
Do you want to be in the... Yes, because
you
there,
move.
please.
Your name is Ricardo. Okay, so now let me do this. Now that Minister Berger has left, move immediately then into getting the panel on trade, climate change relations, as well as the role of the G20. So to land us there, from what we have heard so far, what I'd like to do is volunteer Jim Bacchus to do that. And Jim has been working, as I said before, on an action agenda for trade for the G20. One more word from me is about, again, why we focus on the G20. So there's the transition of the presidency to Argentina, but also because on these global issues, there is a need for a helicopter view, if you like, someone that has an instance of governance that has the ability to look over all the other governance instances that we have and provide leadership and guidance. And the G20 countries, they not only represent a very large share of emissions when it comes to climate, about 80%, but they also represent about 70% of world trade. And so it's just obvious that we have in the G20 the power of governments to, as David Parker said before, they have to not only show the way by example, but also they participate in all other instances of governance that are relevant to solve these problems. So Jim, we're with you.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. And let me begin first by apologizing to all of you. I arrived in Buenos Aires the day before yesterday. My voice will perhaps arrive the day after tomorrow. So I'm doing the best I can here.
It sounds interesting, the voice, so don't worry about it.
For those of you who have not heard me before, I am usually mellifluous, eloquent, speak endlessly. So I won't be speaking endlessly now because my voice won't allow it. Those of us who are lawyers, and especially those lawyers who have been judges, tend to divide matters into two different realms, substance and procedure. We've already heard about substance today, a good bit about it. We've got a proposal that's been on the table for some time from ICTSD and WEF, the E15, in which Gary and I and many of us were engaged for a sustainable energy trade agreement. We've certainly been working a long time for an environmental goods agreement, advocating bringing services into that. We've just had a discussion across the way about the need to discipline fossil fuel subsidies, a perversity in our current public policies. There is a long list of substance that comprises what we might move forward as ways to show that trade can work for climate action. Certainly some of those ways, as we've heard, relate to the oceans. I don't think you can stress too much the significance of the oceans. I'm from Florida, sir. Okay. So there's the issue of fisheries subsidies. That's certainly high on the list. And I, too, am not satisfied if we simply leave Buenos Aires and say, well, we've been negotiating on fisheries subsidies for 10 years, and now we're going to declare that we're going to get serious about it. That seems to be the measure of success here midway through this particular ministerial conference. That's not enough. I would rather, however, focus on procedure. As Ricardo suggested, I'm in the midst now of writing a paper for ICTSD, suggesting ways in which the role of the G20 can be used to make trade work for climate action. Now, my view is the G20 is an untapped resource. There are many summits, there's much that's been done, but let's look at what the G20 said that it is as opposed to what it's accomplished. Pretty much said it runs the planet. That's pretty much what they said a decade ago when they first started coming together. We're in charge. We're going to be the most important institution in the world for moving the global economy forward. All right, that makes sense given all the statistics we heard from Minister Parker about the size and the scope and the depth of the G20. Makes sense. They can propose things and then the rest of the world can either object or change it or move along in concert with the G20. And there are some important things that have been done, certainly in the financial crisis, but not nearly enough. Not nearly enough has been done. At the same time, we've seen in the past few years an evolution in which the G20 has started to do some quieter, concrete things that are beginning to make a difference in some fairly unnoticed ways. For example, in Hangzhou, there was the adoption of just one page of 9 principles of what we should do in terms of global investment. Significantly, on that one page, they mentioned 3 times sustainable development.
That's correct.
And the message from the G20 seems to be that investment must be sustainable. Well, in terms of law, this is a revelation because only in a very few of the most recent investment agreements have we even discussed sustainable development or sustainability. But if we follow through on what the G20 has said, if they follow through on what they've said, we can start reimagining a number of our investment obligations in the world to make certain that foreign direct investment is sustainable investment. It seems to me we can do the same thing as it relates to sustainability, generally and in particular to trade and climate change. Now, a number of us worked together on a report, Ingrid and I, and quite a few from around the world on one of these E15 reports proposing substantive changes in the effort to deal with the nexus between trade and climate change and improve these obligations. But the principal point we made there is that the trade and climate world are 2 different worlds. They're on 2 different planets. The climate negotiators, and I've advised the COP, I was on one of those high-level advisory panels, and I said, look, you need to pay attention to trade. Well, the trade ministries have told us not to touch trade. At the WTO, they've been sitting and waiting for the COP to tell them what the trade world should do about climate change, and the trade world hasn't told them anything. And all of the delegates over at the Hilton are hoping that climate change will go away so they won't have to figure out how it fits in the trade rules. There are a few exceptions. Korea and Mexico and a few others, New Zealand certainly, have been coming forward and saying we need to do more. But for the most part, these are 2 different worlds. So what is the role for the G20? Procedurally, my thought is that one very simple role is as a convener. It became necessary in order to develop these guidelines on investment for the G20 to instruct the finance ministers to get together and come up with some guidelines on investment. Equally, the G20 could instruct the ministers of trade and the ministers of environment to get together and come up with a first approach toward dealing with the nexus between trade and climate change. That would be a major accomplishment in that no one in any official guise or of any official role has done anything at all toward that end. There are a lot of us on the outside who have said many things about it, written many things about it, but no one who can actually make a decision has done anything. It seems to me that would be a very simple place for the G20 to start, to say that the trade and climate worlds are actually one world. Because it turns out that the economy and the environment are not actually separate and apart, they are one and the same. Indeed, the economy is within the environment. There's no way we can approach any economic issue without dealing with the environment, and there's no way we can solve our environmental problems without dealing with the economy, period. And it's about time we realize that. I'll stop there. We have many speakers. I do want to acknowledge the presence of my esteemed colleague from the appellate body, Giorgio Sacerdoti. Judge Sacerdoti, it's good to be with you again, sir. You haven't aged a bit, nor have I.
Thank you, Jim, and welcome, Turkey. So from there, why don't we come perhaps to, I think I'm going to say break for a bit of deeper thinking on, again, the trade climate change front, and then followed by Beatriz, particularly on now how do we bring this G20 into these issues. Axel, and then I'm going to bring Gary at the end. Okay?
Okay.
So,
I don't know if deeper is quite the right adjective coming after Special Envoy Thomson and Jim, both of whom in their own disciplines are, I think, deeper thinkers than I am in whatever discipline I'm part of, and sometimes I'm not sure anymore. And that's the point, I suppose, of this whole exercise here. This is intrinsically intended to be a multidisciplinary discussion, right? We're talking about, you've teed this up as about the trade sorority and the environmental sorority, if you will, fraternity, as the case may be. So let me offer a couple of comments about. It's partly procedural, but it's much more about substance, to use Jim's framing here. If you think about it, we've been through an evolution of the cooperative architecture on the environment. What we now have arrived at is a framework in Paris, which is essentially a multilateral framework to encourage vertical national action. So basically, we said that progress is going to be organized principally nationally through these NDCs, as you've articulated. But to get that framework, we needed a grand exercise in multilateral negotiation. And we tried it. We ran up that hill in Copenhagen, failed, came back down the hill, but succeeded again in Paris, as we all know. And now I guess the question I would ponder here, stimulated by the framing of this session, is, well, is that right? Should we be content essentially with seeing what happens nationally? Or is there some type of a international cooperative undertaking, enterprise, if you will, that is now necessary, and that we shouldn't pat ourselves on the back too much. We shouldn't rest on the laurels from an international cooperation standpoint on the accomplishment of Paris. And I would say the answer to that is resoundingly yes. And let me suggest what I think would be quite effective and how perhaps the G20 could be useful in this regard. And so, as you think about it, sure, countries have it within their wherewithal, their power, theoretically at least, to do all that's necessary to be done to get us to where we need to be on these global goals, and particularly the 2 degree or the 1.5 degree objective that was set in Paris. But the reality is, countries are an extension of humanity. So they're behaviorally a lot like the way people behave. And people behave very often in groups in a way they wouldn't necessarily behave by themselves. So if they're bound together in a group setting, sometimes there are behavioral incentives and other types of dynamics that occur that encourage everybody to do more than they might have done otherwise or do better than they did. And that's how a little bit I think about where we are right now, is that we would benefit, we the international community would benefit by layering back in some degree of international groups, or you might call them clubs or coalitions, that are prepared to lock arms together and agree collectively to do a series of things. My suggestion would be that series of things should not be exhaustive and prescriptive in the sense that everybody has to sign up to exactly the same thing. But I would submit to you, to all of us here, and to the G20, that the following elements might make the good basis of a new round of international, I'm not saying multilateral, cooperation, and I'll expand upon that in a second. First is what was alluded to earlier by Ricardo, certainly in the tariff domain. There's an opportunity to put some positive incentives there by zeroing tariffs on a class of goods, services that are determined to be having a close nexus to positive climate action. So there's a nice negotiation that's going on, making some degree of progress, and we hope that that succeeds, but that's just, if you will, in my view, the basement, the foundation for what could be a much more ambitious undertaking by a coalition of countries such as those that are now participating in this environmental goods agreement. And let me walk through some of the elements here. And I know this is defining trade and trade cooperation more broadly than what happens in the WTO, or even what happens typically within the brief of a trade minister on even a bilateral level. But I think it's important that we think more broadly about the scope of international and economic trade cooperation than just what your portfolio happens to be in the cabinet, if you will. So let me walk through some of the other things that are trade related, but I think would be equally important, if not more significant, than even tariff reductions to the cause. First, the second thing I would say are efficiency standards. A coalition of major countries, major and minor countries for that matter, could agree and align on a series of efficiency standards on a class of industrial. Yes, we made good progress, by the way, on consumer, but importantly, energy-intensive industrial products and the like. And then to link, this is the next part of it, to link a procurement, common procurement initiative, because public procurement actually accounts for a significant amount of the sales of many of the classes of products we're talking about. So if you had a sizable coalition of countries align on standards, link their public procurement policies to it, that would be a significant carrot or inducement or scaling mechanism, if you will, for investors who are thinking about moving into this area or industrial production. Third, next element I would say is certainly subsidies, and there are a few elements of this. One is renewables, is that this club of vanguard countries that wants to make a positive movement on a number of domains could agree to an understanding on the treatment of renewables-related subsidies, a peace clause, if you will, or a safe harbor or common understanding whereby they would not take action against each other because they'd have the same basic sets of guidelines in this area. Fossil fuels. I know fossil fuels, everybody's been talking about fossil fuels for a decade or more. We've defined them, we've measured them. We just, as Jim was saying, we really haven't moved effectively together. But such a group of countries could lock arms and identify a trajectory commonly and have a little bit of peer review and accountability for how they're making progress. It doesn't have to be the exact same performance along the trajectory, but just the fact that they're on a common trajectory, taking it seriously, putting it in the context of a multifaceted strategy of the type I'm beginning to lay out here, could have a powerful incentive effect in their countries and elsewhere. The next thing I would argue would be, I know this is a little bit far afield from a trade ministerial, but what I call blended finance for sustainable infrastructure. Now, the infrastructure people don't think of that as climate finance. And even the climate finance people, you know, the climate negotiators don't think of sustainable infrastructure, public-private financing frameworks, how you stack concessional money or the balance sheets of public sector entities with different elements of debt and equity provided by private sector providers, whether they be private equity firms or pension funds or sovereign wealth funds, as the case may be. But that stacking, getting a better model and a commitment to scale that, is fundamental to financing the biggest ticket item for the SDGs, which is the replacement or retrofitting of infrastructure so that it is sustainable and low carbon. That has to be part of any effective climate change strategy. It is an exercise, it would require an exercise in international economic cooperation. The G20 has anointed itself the premier body for international economic cooperation, which includes trade, but frankly includes investment as well. And investment is another key driver of progress in this area. And if that group of countries went because they own the multilateral development banks, they sit on the boards of those institutions. If they exercise their board obligations in a manner that understood that those institutions should progressively, rapidly, beginning to change their business model so that they're primarily no longer direct lenders, but rather using their balance sheets to catalyze this blending of public and private finance, which has a much bigger impact in the market, that would have a profound and transformative effect. Last item here, if I can, and this maybe gets back more into in the heart of what a lot of trade people discuss, is on carbon offsets and pricing. So let me suggest a couple of elements here. One is that such a group of countries could effectively form a buyer's club for large ticket offsets to help facilitate for big industrial emitters who really can't mitigate as fast as they would like to and would like to buy. They could help, such a coordinated exercise in international cooperation could help to match large-scale demand for such offsets with large-scale developing country supply. I know we have emissions trading systems and markets, but frankly, they have had a marginal effect on things. But we're in a new era. There are the SDGs, there's Paris, et cetera. There's significant demand out there that could be facilitated. I think of it a little bit like private placements, if you will. There could be quite a powerful effect that a club could do. And lastly, related to that is on the carbon pricing side. Such a group of countries, well, I don't think that it's likely that they would agree to a uniform approach to carbon pricing anytime soon. I do think that a group of forward-leaning countries could come up with some sort of a mutual recognition of equivalence of their carbon pricing measures, whether it be through the tax instruments or through cap and trade and trading in the system, that would have a rough equivalence of its carbon price equivalent, that they could agree, again, sort of like a safe harbor or a peace clause, and say, look, we all are going to, through whatever our means, whatever our political economies can deliver, however that instrument might look, as long as it is at roughly this kind of a carbon price equivalent, we will not put on border tax measures. And we're going to move together in this fashion. This is something that the G20, which has already moved from being a place that can only do things by consensus, very importantly during the German presidency, they went 19+1. On what issue? On climate. And so there is scope right now for the G20 to start a bit of a process, say that not every G20 country needs to be part of it, and moreover, non-G20 countries could be part of such a coalition of forward-moving countries. And let's just start the dynamic along those lines. This would be a very powerful way, I think, of putting in a mezzanine level between multilateral and national level of international cooperation, which could really transform the issue and make the trading system, the world economy, be a much more powerful force for progress on climate.
Thank you. Excellent, Rick. That's a big agenda, and it's specific to G20. We've explored some of those issues, but there are some good ideas also to take forward. And it's probably a good moment to then turn the floor to Beatriz, who's been thinking about some of these economics.
Thank you.
Beatriz.
Thank you, Ricardo. Well, Ricardo has put me on the spot. I'm the last one to speak after these experts on the area. No, the one before last. The one before last. Two more. Okay. Yes, you have Axel, and he invited me today to join the team. But anyway, so in order to do my part, the first thing I want to ask is how many people in the audience come from G20 countries? Could you raise your hands, please? Okay. And how many among you, and thank you for being here, are from Argentina? Okay. And how many from government positions or legislative positions in Argentina? Just one? Just one. Okay. This is for my end comments. Okay, thank you anyway. Well, I think a lot has been said on why to focus on climate change. So I'm not going to repeat myself, just the titles, is because this is happening now and fast and has devastating effects on the environment, on human beings. Peter Thomson raised the example of the islands and the Caribbean, and has economic consequences, and G20 has to do with economic consequences as well. So tackling climate change is an environmental imperative, but also is a human, economic, and social imperative. High risks of climate change not only will affect the stability of the global economy, but also has high risk in terms of growth, in terms of inclusiveness, and moreover, in terms of equality, because whenever there's a climate accident, the most vulnerable people are the most affected. Also, Ricardo in the introduction said that although we have the Paris Agreement, if we add pledges of all countries, we are still headed to an increase in warming. So more needs to be done. And in order to do this, what can trade do? Yesterday, we debated trade policy in other forums here at the seminar. Richard Samans, at the time he made the presentation, I was at the audience. He said we need to redefine objectives. The objective should not be only to increase trade flow, should not be to increase GDP, but we have to improve living standards. This is a key factor for fighting climate change is key to improve living standards. So we need a more inclusive and sustainable trade policy, and in order to promote a shift to a low carbon economy. Ideally, the institution will be the WTO, but we all know the blockages and bottlenecks there in WTO right now to deal even with the fishery subsidies, or to ban the fishery subsidies, and come with a decision now at the WTO ministerial. So we also need, not only that we need to put a ban on, we need to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. And next year is going to be 70 years since Bretton Woods Agreement and since the GATT, which was the former institution of WTO, was created. And still we don't have multilateral rules for agriculture and food production. And we have subsidies also in agriculture and food production that are damaging, that have devastating consequences on the environment as well. So if we cannot have a dialogue or an efficient or a dialogue with results, because there is dialogue, we don't have outcomes from that dialogue in the WTO, why bring this to the G20? And why bring this to the G20 when a major country, a member country of the G20 like the US has changed both trade and environmental policy this year and has withdrawn during the summer from the Paris Agreement? How are we going to do that if we, like Richard mentioned, the Hamburg's leaders' declarations says that there are 19 countries that support and want to advance their commitments in terms of the Paris Agreement, but there is one that doesn't. And let me tell you, because I was Sherpa at the moment, there was a lot of discussion, and I mean, there is some confidentiality, but even at some point, Germany was not comfortable with the position that we have to say 19 and 1. If it wasn't because the G7 coordinated in Taormina before and said that, and we finally had to come to this formula, we wouldn't have said that. So it is very difficult, but I think I agree that the G20, it's a forum for many reasons, although we have these difficulties. So we have shadows and lines, pros and cons. Because it's a leaders-led forum where decision-making is based on dialogue and consensus. We won't have full consensus, but we need to start a dialogue if we're going to arrive at some point at a consensus. And the dialogue, you don't need a dialogue when everybody agrees. When everybody agrees on something, you just need action, initiatives. You need a dialogue when there are different views or different perceptions to find common grounds, to find bridges, in order to solve the problem. So I think the G20 is a key forum because it's not a regulatory forum. It doesn't deal with rule-making, but it does deal with consensus on principles or initiatives that afterwards can be either implemented through the multilateral institutions or domestically in domestic policies. Regarding the G20, also something that we can say in terms of pros of G20 is that it was mentioned before. I think it was Bacchus who mentioned the fact that since 2016, with the Chinese presidency of the G20, there is a more vision-oriented agenda in G20, and Germany pick up on that, and I think Argentina is picking up on that, given the priorities. So I think it's the forum, but it's the right forum to have a dialogue. We shouldn't expect results in the short term, but we need to start a global dialogue in G20, and then make an outreach of this dialogue to other multilateral institutions and forums. You shouldn't stay in the G20 only. The Argentine presidency, what hopes we can have to start this dialogue on the Argentine presidency? And I'm not speaking for the government. I'm not in the government anymore. I was formerly, like I said, in the cabinet of Minister Malcorra, but I'm not in the government anymore. So I'm speaking like an expert I'm not from the environmental sorority. I'm not from I was at some point in the trade sorority, but I just said I'm more on the sustainable development sorority now, and plus innovation and inclusion. So on the lights, on the hopes, what we have, first the motto of G20 that the Argentine presidency had put: building consensus for equitable and sustainable development. So that's right. We need consensus first, because there are different visions and different perceptions. Second, on the priorities, there are two priorities that are clearly linked to climate change. One was already mentioned. What are the three priorities? The first one the president announced was the future of work. The second is financing for infrastructure, where already it was said that sustainable finance is key, or finance for sustainable infrastructure is key, and multilateral development banks have a key role in this, Richard said, in blending public-private finance. And the third one is a sustainable future for fruit production in the world. And let me say that also the future of work is related to climate change, because now with new technologies, with artificial intelligence, we have better information to use scarce resources differently and more intelligently. But let me get to the third priority, the future of sustainable agriculture. G20 countries are, I read this reading the Argentine priorities, 60% of agricultural soils. G20 countries are responsible for 60% of agricultural soils, and also more or less the same proportion, 80% of agricultural goods. And also the government says that the world needs a more inclusive and environmentally efficient supply system of food in the world, and this requires to increase soil productivity without negatively impacting the environment. This is on the website. I look at the website. So definitely, if the government wants to address this and soil fertility without impacting the environment, it has to be linked to trade, because the system we have now and the system we had since Bretton Woods institutions were created, where we admit distorting agricultural subsidies on agricultural productions, are not only creating a problem in terms of climate change, particularly in certain developed countries, but also are hampering the development of Africa. Africa has a significant quantity of fertile soils. I think I read recently that there were 4 million or 14 million, I don't remember if it was 4 or 14 million of hectares that could be developed for agriculture in Africa. But for that, you need technology, you need cooperation, but also you need market incentives. So access to the markets of Europe is key, and access to the markets of the world is key. So you need to negotiate market access and reduce subsidies for this production in Africa to take place. And this is key in Africa to end hunger, to diminish migration. There was a great concern in Germany about migration coming from Africa. Africa has a very young population. It will have for decades. It will continue coming if there are no opportunities for development in Africa. If all that I studied about development is true, I mean, I studied, development starts with agricultural development. You're not going to move to a complex service economy without starting with agricultural development. So finally, the issue of trade, if we're going to deal with this priority, the issue of trade and trade subsidies in agriculture is going to come through. So I think with this, and I end, the last thing I want to say is that there is another, when Richard was talking about the group of countries, this year I want to highlight that the 3 invited countries that Argentina invited to the G20 are leading examples in terms of sustainable development. Chile in South America, the Netherlands in Europe, and Costa Rica in Central America. So I think they're great partners also for this initiative. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Beatriz, and thank you for bringing the agricultural piece.
Yes, thank you.
So, Gary, some responses from your part?
I'll be brief because we want to get to the questions. I'm going to deal very quickly with the WTO rules, current and future. So you start with the current rules and climate change. They're not optimal, and I'll tell you some of the problems, but it's still interesting. They're usable and they're misused. So there's a problem that's political. All of the cases brought to the WTO challenging energy subsidies, challenge renewable energy. None of them challenge fossil fuels. Think about it, and we all know the numbers. There's way more money going into fossil fuels. All of the cases challenge renewable energy. So why does no one challenge fossil fuels? The rules permit it. There's no problem challenging it. Any country, and if you want to be really strict about it, you have to, a country, because you have to have a country to bring a case, would have to have a fossil fuel industry. They all do. Argentina is an oil producer, right? It's not just OPEC. So 60, 70, 80 at least countries produce crude oil. Maybe not in Saudi amounts, but they produce it. All you need is 1 barrel under the rules. So why does no one challenge fossil fuel subsidies? And why does everyone challenge renewable energy? And that tells you it's not the dispute settlement bodies. It's not the panels. It's not the appellate body. The dispute settlement bodies have leaned over totally backward, stretched as far as they can to favor renewable energy and the environment in ways that probably go too far. And we can dispute that outside the room with some of the authors. But there's no question their heart's been in the right place. It's WTO members don't bring the cases. That's on renewable energy and fossil fuels. Fish, you can challenge the subsidies. There's no problem. No one brings a case. You would probably have to, again, using my lawyer's instinct, you probably want to own 1 ocean fishing boat as a country if you want to bring the case. How many countries have fishing boats? Well, subtract the landlocked, and that's everyone. So again, the problem is not the rules or the decision makers. It's the countries. So all these countries that sign these declarations don't do what they could do today. That's point 1 on the existing rules. At a national level, using national trade remedies, my favorite from the Swedish National Board of Trade, I haven't seen the more recent numbers, it's just a few years ago, 2/3 of all EU anti-dumping duties were on renewable energy. 2/3. Not steel, not clothing, against renewable energy. So let's raise the price of renewable energy in Europe so it's not competitive with fossil fuels. Again, don't blame the WTO, don't blame the rules, don't blame the decision makers. That's, how many of these declarations has the European Union signed? All of them, right? So look at what they do. And I'm not picking on the EU particularly. This is every country. So the existing rules are there, no one's using them. And that's a problem. You could bring, I was tried to help an NGO bring a case on fishing subsidies 15 years ago, and we couldn't find a country to bring it. That simple. The subsidies are obvious and well documented. So, what's wrong with the rules? What would you do to improve them? Well, lots. So you would take the existing rules. First and foremost, all the existing WTO rules, and I know there's preambular language about the environment, which the appellate body has used, but basically the original GATT and the WTO was all focused on protecting one set of producers from another, yours from theirs. Not just the subsidy rules, all of it. That's the fundamental. So you have to build in an explicit preambular language that the global goods, fish, you know, the atmosphere, whatever, is more important than producer goods. And that will take a change. And that would enable the decision makers to do these cases even more easily, and you wouldn't need a fishing boat or an oil well to bring them. That's pie in the sky for the moment. As I said, the existing rules are fine. If you could change the rules, if there was a political will beyond signing declarations, you would require a phase out of fossil fuel subsidies. It's no problem. 2 kinds of subsidies are already banned. You would explicitly permit subsidies to renewable energy. Again, there was a similar provision which disappeared after 5 years. This is all doable. I'm saying there's an agenda you could do in the trade area, and it would make things better, but right now you can use existing rules and they're not used. One final observation is the politics of it. I think despite my own country's current aberration, which won't last, the politics is headed in the right way in developing countries because of the declining cost of renewable energy, and particularly as wind, solar, and possibly tides or things like that comes in, it will be cheaper than fossil fuels. What people in developing countries are worried about is changing. They don't like having to change their lifestyle. They don't want to give up the way they live. And that's going to change. So you'll be able to keep your car, and if you're American, 2 cars, drive around, live in a suburban house, and emit 0. Because the big car companies have announced they're going to be making mainly and eventually exclusively electric cars. You won't have a choice, and you won't mind, because no one's actually, very few people, probably very, very few, are committed to fossil fuel engines. None of the car companies are committed to making fossil fuel cars. They're committed to making cars. Ferdinand Porsche designed an electric car, and a hybrid, mind you, in 1902. The batteries weren't ready. So there's nothing sacred in the auto industry now about fossil fuels. So the politics will change more favorably. It already is. And with luck, we won't need more disasters to change it. It'll be better. It'll change because people will see it doesn't threaten their jobs or their lifestyle.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you for that very... Axel, you have about 4 minutes to sort of think from your experience on analyzing G20 in the past few years and impact on policies. To give us some reflections there.
Well, thank you very much, Ricardo and ICTSD, for inviting me to this fascinating panel. As we are talking about the nexus between trade and climate, let me highlight that below the radar of the multilateral trading system, actually a lot of things are happening. Ricardo just mentioned a study by a colleague of my institute, Clara Brandi, where she looked into the NDCs. And she found a lot of trade rules and trade components there. So the climate actions by the countries, the intended climate actions by the countries entail actually a lot of trade components. And also on the other side, if you look at bilateral regional trade agreements, you will find a lot of environmental content. So we are working with a colleague from Canada on this subject. We built a hopefully useful website. It's trendanalytics.info, and we found that there are almost 300 different environmental-related provisions in free trade agreements. If we look at the most recent agreements, we find that these most recent agreements include 60 different environmental provisions on average. So a lot of things are happening below the radar of the multilateral trading system. But I would argue we need a functioning multilateral trading system to better align climate and trade. We need better coordination in order to avoid trouble around carbon border adjustments, which might pop up if we think about the NDC processes. We need more coordination in order to avoid trade restrictions and green protectionism. We need functioning multilateral trading systems to increase transparency, to have learning processes of best practice, and maybe finally also rulemaking. So we need a functioning multilateral system, and I would argue the G20 plays a key role in that respect. And I would like to highlight 3 points. First of all, the G20 has been very good in terms of consensus building, dialogue and consensus building, and has played a role in supporting the adoption of the trade facilitation agreement in the WTO. It has been supporting the adoption of the Paris climate agreement. So consensus building, that's the first major contribution of the G20 for multilateralism. Then secondly, supporting multilateralism, so supporting the structures that are already there. We've mentioned the decision or the adoption of a commitment in the German presidency on the rules-based system on the WTO, which was not an easy to do thing given the current position in the US. And again, there was also a strong commitment of at least 19 members of the G20 on the Paris climate agreement. I think this G19 consensus was important in 2017, but from my perspective, it's not sustainable over long term, and we should not move in other areas to these G19, G17 constellations. I think that's not the way we should go, but the G20 has played a big role here to stabilize multilateralism. So that was my second point. And the third point I would like to make, and then I'll stop. In Hangzhou in 2016, the G20 committed to the implementation of the Agenda 2030. And the G20 committed to align its work, not only the development sphere of the G20, but the whole range of G20 topics and work streams. They should be aligned to the Agenda 2030, and I think that's quite significant in terms of coming up with more policy coherence. If you think about trade and climate, and what I heard from the Argentinian process, they are trying to create better opportunities among the work streams to better talk to each other, and I think there's a great potential, at least here, to use the Agenda 2030 and the big role the G20 has to play here in order to also support multilateralism. And there I stop.
No, thank you, Axel, and thank you. That was synthetic but to the point.
Yes.
So we're out of time, and I have to apologize to the audience for that. Just one word in finishing. The G20 is about policy coordination. It's about coherence in global economic governance. So all we have talked about here is related to providing that leadership in that respect. As we see it here, the President Macron has convened a climate summit to focus on financing, climate financing. We have been desperately looking as a world for about $100 billion a year of commitment to climate financing. And here we're talking about fossil fuel subsidies that amount to at least $600 billion a year, and some 300 billion or so in fisheries subsidies. So we're wasting, or money, or rather governments are wasting the public money in funding and subsidizing bad, if you like, right? So exactly perverse action on an economic activity while they can find the money to finance the good and the climate action. You mentioned also, just to highlight that every society and every of these countries live in glass houses, and so that's why we don't have a complex political economy, particularly of the energy industry, which doesn't help the fact that we have not been able to move forward. But I think we all agree that there's a need for better governance and better cooperation, and there are great opportunities to move these issues with leadership from the G20. And so we hope, again, that Argentina can pick up these complex themes, and that we can all contribute to that. Thank you all very much, and thank you for the patience.
Thank you.
Thank you.